Okay, there we go. So Corey laid down the gauntlet, which meant that during the talk I had to come up with a limerick. So here we go. It's terribly unfair, and apologies to Holly. Ready? Sincere is my promise to Holly to keep all my comments quite jolly, but the reasons are deep, not that promise to keep. It's valueless, jeepers by golly. Okay. All right, this is a lovely paper. It's beautifully written, challenging, clear, just a total gem. I just can't bring myself to criticize it. Oh, okay, well, maybe just a little bit. What I would like to do is raise some questions about it. They're a bit scattershot, so bear with me. I'm confident that Holly has answers to all of them. So here goes. First, Holly's paper starts with a paradox and then leads us deeper and deeper into ever more paradoxical territory. Although it may appear at first that keeping a promise has positive deontic value, Holly argues that keeping a promise has no deontic value at all. One of her arguments for this is that the contrary supposition entails the unfortunate result that, quote, an agent has a derivative obligation to make a promise to perform an action that it would otherwise be wrong for her to perform, even though common sense judges that she should neither make the promise nor keep it, unquote. As Holly argues, quote, this problem arises because whether or not an agent should perform a present action depends partly on what performing that action would lead her to do later on, unquote. Lead her to do. My question here is what leads to means in this context. My initial thought was that leads to means causes or brings about. But Holly illustrates her use by saying that, quote, an emergency technician should fill the oxygen tanks in his ambulance because doing so will lead to his saving lives later on, unquote. And the problem is that an EMT's filling an oxygen tank doesn't actually cause him to save lives later. At best, we can say that filling the tank is a necessary condition of his saving lives later, that it makes it possible for him to save lives later. So I guess I'm having trouble fixing on the relevant sense of leads to in Holly's characterization of a derivative obligation. I remain perplexed when I consider Holly's endorsement of the following principle, quote, if keeping a promise has positive value, then any act of making a promise that leads to the agent's keeping that promise is guaranteed to produce that positive value, unquote. The problem for me is that this is true only on the assumption that leads to means or entails is sufficient for. But this is not the interpretation of leads to suggested by the EMT example. So we have a dilemma. Either leads to makes sense of the EMT example, in which case the principle is false, the principle I just quoted, or leads to is given a reading that makes the principle true, in which case it no longer makes sense of the EMT example. So I'm just perplexed. Okay, second question. With respect to the Jim Rachel example, I think that's on your handout, Holly stipulates, quote, if I make the promise to Jim, I will keep it, whereas if I don't make such a promise, I will wind up eating lunch with Rachel, unquote. Here I don't understand how it can be stipulated as part of any realistic example that anyone's making a promise will automatically issue in her keeping it. After a promise has been made, there is always a choice whether to keep it. Often that choice requires moral reasoning. Keeping a promise is important, but sometimes circumstances might dictate breaking a promise. Oh, wait, are there any Kantians in the room? Okay, staying with the example, Holly says that if the standard view is correct that both keeping and violating promises are relatively weighty moral matters, we could ascribe a moral value of plus 10 to keeping any promise, while ascribing a moral disvalue of minus 10 to breaking my promise. Well, I wonder about this. All of these numbers make sense only relative to the other numbers. It seems to me that some promises are more important than others, as Holly recognizes in one of the footnotes to her paper. I would think that breaking a marriage vow, for example, has much greater negative deontic value than breaking a promise to go to the movies with an acquaintance. Breaking a promise to have lunch with a colleague, with apologies to my colleagues who will be greatly offended by this, is just not that big of a deal. If Rachel's feeling warmly welcomed to the department is a plus 3, then I would think that breaking a promise to have lunch with Jim would rate oh, I don't know, a -2 if I'm, busy doing the, comparative numbers. And Jim's feeling insulted seems worse than Rachel's feeling welcomed, so I'd give that a -5. In that case, the numbers will look different, and in fact, I haven't had time to set them up for you, but it would turn out, I think, that if these are the numbers, then whether or not I promise to eat lunch with Jim, more value will actually be created if I eat with Rachel. So there's no reason for me to promise to eat with Jim. Now, maybe that's just, I'm just playing around with this particular case, and, if you describe the case slightly differently, then, the numbers will come out exactly the way Holly wants them to. So I recognize that. All right, third comment. Holly says that the remedy for the Jim-Rachel problem, which is that I have reason to make a promise to Jim based on the fact that more deontic value will be created when I keep it, the remedy for this problem is to deny that keeping the promise has any positive value while continuing to assign breaking the promise negative value, unquote. This is the asymmetry that Holly favors, at first in the case of promises and other created duties. So I have a question about this. Suppose I promise to do something that turns out to be objectively wrong. Does breaking the promise have negative value? Here is an example. I promise to defend you and later discover that you are an evil mastermind. Is there any negative value in breaking my promise to defend you? Now suppose I keep my promise to do something that turns out to be objectively wrong. Does my keeping my promise have no value at all, negative or positive? All right, fourth, here's a question about created duties. Holly says that it's probably the case that most of the duties we are under are ones we created, in the sense that some earlier course of action we undertook resulted in our having that duty, when a different course of action would not have resulted in our having that duty. Ah, a counterfactual conditional. I always get worried with counterfactual conditionals. Here I worry that this counterfactual doesn't capture the intuitive difference between created and uncreated duties. It's true that if I hadn't walked past the pond, I wouldn't have come under a duty to save the drowning child. But the duty to save the child is not in the relevant sense created. Created duties are duties that come into existence by virtue of something the agent does. Suppose I walk past the Empire State Building and Voldemort plucks me up from the sidewalk outside the building and drops me right next to the pond. I come under a duty to save the child, but not by virtue of something I did. We don't want to say that by walking past the Empire State Building I created a duty to save the child, even if it's true that if I hadn't walked past the Empire State Building, I wouldn't have come under that duty. Holly writes that, quote, if fulfilling these created duties has positive deontic value, then the lover has derivative reason to impregnate the woman so that he can garner positive deontic value from keeping the ensuing duty to provide child support, unquote. But, and here I'm just referencing something I said a little earlier, the impregnation of the woman does not automatically result in the fulfillment of the duty to provide child support. We have a necessity but not a sufficiency relation here. The most we can say is that by impregnating the woman, the lover creates an opportunity for him to fulfill a newly created duty. And perhaps that's a good thing, but it doesn't have deontic value, and its value is not close enough to the negative value of the overall consequences of impregnation to outweigh it. Okay, fifth. In the realm of non-created duties, I think something similar is going to apply to the case of Paul's relation to Beth and Andrew. Setting up the trust to benefit Andrew creates an opportunity to fulfill one's duty to Andrew. The setting up of the trust does not automatically result in using the money to benefit Andrew. That's another choice. But here, too, there is the point that the case against assigning positive deontic value to fulfilling non-created duties depends on the case against assigning positive deontic value to created duties. So if the argument for the latter claim fails, so does the argument for the former. All right, sixth. In responding to the first objection to her asymmetrical account, Holly claims that you fulfill many prima facie duties, such as the duty not to claw or stab the people who are sitting next to you at a concert, without even thinking that greater merit accrues to your conduct than you think accrues to some morally neutral act, such as opening your concert program. This might be right, but perhaps only because what is at issue here is the fulfillment of negative duties rather than positive duties. It may be that the fulfillment of a negative duty has very little or no merit, while the fulfillment of a positive duty has much more merit. But there is another issue here too. I'm not sure I follow the connection between merit on the one hand and deontic value on the other. I would have thought that these are different things. Deontic value is a measure of the weight or stringency of a duty. I would think, for example, that the weight of the duty not to kill an innocent person is pretty high. The duty not to kill you is far more stringent than, say, the duty not to pinch you. But I don't see any greater merit accruing to me for not killing you than for not pinching you, at least under ordinary circumstances. So I'm not seeing how the fact that no greater merit accrues to X than it does to Y even serves as evidence for the claim that the weight of the duty to X is no greater than the weight of the duty to Y. Consider the case of Charlene, who truthfully answers no when a professor asks her whether her friend Ed cheated on a test. About this case, Holly says that Charlene's alternatives to saying no would each involve her violating several prima facie duties and would be morally bad choices. She continues, quote, "So there is a major moral difference between performing a morally neutral act and performing one that fulfills prima facie duties, but the difference arises from the nature of their alternatives, not from the intrinsic moral quality of the acts themselves," unquote. Now, since we all know and love Frankfurt cases, let me try to Frankfurt this one. Suppose that Charlene truthfully answered no, but if she had shown any signs of choosing to answer yes, a counterfactual intervener would have made her decide to answer no. So although there was a logically possible alternative for Charlene, it was not really or physically possible for her. We don't want to say that she could have done otherwise. But don't we still want to say that there is a major moral difference between Charlene's answering no without having been made to do so and Charlene's tying her left shoe? Okay, finally, Holly says that on her asymmetrical view, the person who spends the week keeping promises, avoiding face-saving lies, and so forth, lives a morally better life than the person who merely performs a series of morally neutral acts. But, says Holly, quote, "The higher quality of her life emerges from two features of her situation. First, the fact that she had but didn't take alternatives that would have violated her prima facie duties, and second, the fact that these alternatives would have been personally preferable for her, but that nonetheless she fulfilled her duties," unquote. Here my thought is that I'm not sure why we have moved from the question whether Charlene's actions have positive deontic value to the question whether Charlene's life has high or low moral quality, whether she is a better person. The symmetry lover, I don't know if I am one, but if there were one, the symmetry lover need not commit, I think, to any view about what makes people better persons or what gives lives a higher or lower moral quality. The issue is narrower than that, the deontic value of actions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sam. A very helpful set of comments and a limerick to boot. What more could I ask? I'll say some things about some of these comments, not try to address them all. So Sam registers qualms about my assumption that, for example, my making the promise to meet Jim for lunch will automatically result in my meeting him for lunch. He points out that, after all, I will subsequently have a choice whether or not to keep that promise. And sometimes he expresses this point by noting that the agent's earlier action, for example, the lover's impregnating his girlfriend, doesn't cause him to subsequently fulfill his duty to provide child support. The impregnation is merely a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition for his later fulfilling his duty. I'm not quite sure, actually, what the difficulty here is supposed to be. I don't claim that the earlier action automatically results in the later action. I merely claim that it's in fact the case that if he performs the earlier action, he will then perform the later action. Such facts obtain all the time, it seems to me, and my view is that they're relevant to whether or not I ought to make the promise or create the duty, as the case might be. And that doesn't depend, I don't take any stand on whether my earlier act causes my later act, or is a necessary condition for it, or is sufficient in the circumstances for it, or whatever. That's something that would have to be developed, but it seems to me an independent issue. Some of Sam's remarks suggest he's taking the position that we ought to approach these cases as a possibilist rather than an actualist. But I argue that possibilism isn't going to do the trick here, so I don't think that's going to work out. Conceivably, Sam holds the position that an agent only has a derivative duty to perform an earlier act A in light of her subsequent act B in circumstances in which there is no intervening free choice by the agent or by any other agent. But if Act B, the later act, really is an act that is right or wrong because it fulfills or violates an obligation, then the performance of B, or its non-performance, will necessarily be the result of a free choice. So there's always going to be an intervening free choice in cases like this. To insist that no free choice can intervene between the earlier act and the later act seems to me to commit Sam to the position, if that's what he wants to do, that we have no derivative duties to act now in light of our actual or possible subsequent duties. That's a very radical position, and it leaves only non-act consequentialist considerations as the kind of future events that could affect our duty to act now. I find this wholly implausible. For example, suppose Ben is going to vote on a junior colleague's tenure case tomorrow. Ben has not read the tenure file, and I think he has a duty to read that tenure file beforehand, partly because if he doesn't, he will then mistakenly and wrongly vote against this deserving candidate. Even if no other harm is done, because Ben's colleagues all vote in favor of the candidate and he gets through and gets tenure, Ben casts an unjust vote, which he could have avoided by carrying out his derivative duty to acquaint himself with the candidate's qualifications. There are many such cases, it seems to me, and it takes a pretty strong stomach to deny that we have derivative duties of this kind. In the lunch case, I say that violating my promise to Jim would have negative value, and Sam quite rightly points out that there are cases in which violating your promise doesn't necessarily have negative value, such as where I promise to do something wrong. I completely agree. I should say something about that. Cases in which a promise is elicited by fraud or deception or coercion, or is a promise to do something wrong and so on, are ones in which there's probably no negative deonic value to failing to fulfill that. So that's something that I should accommodate, but doesn't affect kind of the main line of argument here. I say it's probably the case that most of the duties we're under are ones we created, in the sense that some earlier course of action we undertook resulted in our having that duty, when a different course of action would not have resulted in our having that duty. Sam objects that this counterfactual doesn't adequately capture the difference between created and non-creative duties, citing a case in which I walk in front of the Empire State Building and Voldemort snatches me up and places me, you can tell who has kids of a certain age by their examples. Voldemort snatches me up and places me by a shallow pond where a child is drowning, as a result of which I come under a duty to save the child. But, Sam says, even though it's true that if I hadn't walked by the Empire State Building, I wouldn't have had that duty, it doesn't count as a created duty. I don't think we want to spend time wrangling about what the term created duty means, since I've introduced it as more or less a technical term here, and there's probably no fixed meaning in ordinary English. In the case of promises, one makes a promise with the intention of creating a duty, but I'm pointing out all the other kinds of cases in which one acts in ways that result in one's having a subsequent duty, whether or not one foresaw it or intended it. The question is whether the moral status of one's earlier action in such a case is affected by whether or not one has that later duty and carries it out or not. So the question is whether I have a derivative duty to walk by the Empire State Building so that Voldemort will snatch me up, and I will thus come under a duty to save the child. I think both Sam and I probably agree that I don't have a deontological duty to walk by the Empire State Building, but I get that result by saying I don't get any positive deonic value from creating this duty. I'm not quite sure how Sam would get it. I point out that my asymmetrical view implies, perhaps counterintuitively, that an act that fulfills several prima facie duties and violates none has the same deonic value as an act that's morally neutral, neither fulfilling nor violating any such duties. In supporting my view, I point out that we don't normally think that any greater merit accrues to you, to your conduct when you omit to stab or claw the person next to you, as you think accrues to some morally neutral act, such as merely opening your program when there's no one next to you that you could have hurt. Sam points out that in mentioning merit, I seem to have changed topics by shifting the discussion from the central topic, namely the deonic value of an act, to discussing a separate question, namely the merit or praiseworthiness of the agent. He's right that this shift came too fast and without notification to the audience, so to speak. It's also true, however, I think, that the deonic value of an act and the blameworthiness or praiseworthiness of an agent for performing that act tend to be connected, pretty closely connected in certain ways. So these two issues are linked. I think what I should have said is first that the actual deonic value of an act performed by a dutiful agent is the same as the actual deonic value of an act performed by somebody who does something morally neutral, namely 0. But there's a more complex sense in which we can say that the dutiful agent does something better relative to her options. She fulfills her duty rather than violating it, than is done by the other agent who merely chooses one among many morally neutral options. There's nothing she could have done that would have been worse. Second, on the question of of praiseworthiness, I think moral philosophers misuse the term praiseworthy as the opposite of blameworthy when really it isn't. I think we sometimes praise a person who has the opportunity to violate a duty but instead fulfills it, whereas we don't praise a person who doesn't have the opportunity to violate a duty and doesn't violate it. We feel that praise is deserved when the person who fulfills her duty does so at some substantial personal cost or sacrifice. But many duties are fulfilled at no such cost. If you're not tempted to stab or claw your neighbor, then there's no sacrifice in not stabbing or clawing your neighbor, and you don't deserve any praise for that kind of duty fulfillment. Morally neutral acts don't typically raise this issue of personal cost because there usually isn't any personal cost involved. So praise just doesn't usually enter the picture. What that means is that praise can accrue to agents who fulfill burdensome duties, but doesn't usually accrue to agents who merely carry out morally neutral acts. I'll leave the Frankfurt case of Charlene for the Q&A, so thanks.
So I had two kind of small questions. First of all, I was wondering, so it seems to me there might be a sense in which a world that, contains some duties that are fulfilled is a better world in which, better than a world in which, no duties come into existence and are not, right? So there's no duty fulfillment in the other world. So that might give an intuitive, you might think that there's therefore some positive value that attaches to making promises and keeping them, right? If you buy that sort of intuition, maybe one way to capture it would be to say that the value of bringing or making a promise and then keeping it is a decreasing function of the number of promises you've made, or maybe also the importance of the promises you've made. I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out there as a possible way to capture the intuition, if you share it, that there might be something valuable about that kind of world. So that's the one question. The other question is, has to do with the non-identity problem. I kept thinking about this the whole time through, right? There's, in the same way that people in that literature, the non-identity problem.
Oh, okay.
So in the same way people say that, there's not a duty to have more kids, just in order to, or there's not a duty to bring more happy children into existence, right? Similarly, there's not a duty to make promises. It seems like there's sort of an analog there, and I was wondering if you might sort of adopt some of the responses to, some of the ways of addressing the non-identity problem. So some people might take right, there's the argument for the repugnant conclusion. You might sort of take that to be a problem for the idea that there's that we ought to maximize total utility. That's what generates the problem. So maybe something similar here, you might adopt the idea that there's, you know, it's not the case that we ought to maximize total deontic value. Possibly, maybe we should shoot for average deontic value. I get there are problems associated with that too, obviously. But a different solution that I think seems plausible is the idea that maybe the duty to maximize deontic value only comes up in cases where the number of promises are held fixed, or maybe the content of the promises also are held fixed. And it's only then that it makes sense to apply this idea that we ought to maximize deontic value. So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Okay, your intuition that there seems to be greater value to a world in which people have duties and fulfill them than a world in which nobody ever has any kind of duty. That's partly what I was trying to get at kind of with the Charlene case and wondering, you know, how about this week in which one person does all this great stuff, fulfilling her duties, and the other person does nothing. I don't know that I've really completely come to grips with that, but I'm inclined to think that insofar as there is positive value to such a world, it's a positive value arising from the agents in it because of what they do. I'm sorry, not because of what they do, but because of the kinds of agents they are making certain kinds of choices. We need to look at the moral worth of the agents rather than look at the moral worth of their acts to get a handle on that. That's why I veered off in this direction of merit and praiseworthiness and so on. Okay, the non-identity problem and the Republican conclusion and so on. I don't think maximizing the average deontic value of keeping promises and so on, you know, that's not going to help here at all. Whether there's something in that vicinity, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. An idea worth pursuing at any rate. Yeah.
35. I found that really interesting, and I found your view that there's no positive value in fulfilling a duty per se plausible. But at one point, so you considered the suggestion that somebody might think that deontic value is a confused mishmash, and then you argued against it. So I want to just say that I think there's more to that thought. More to be said in defense of that thought, because it looks that's a mishmash, because it's trying to bring consequentialist ways of ranking value into the idea of duty and fulfilling duties. And your main defense of why we need it was that anybody who has an ethic of duty needs a way of ranking duties and working out what to do when duties compete. And that seems completely plausible. Anybody who has an ethic of duties needs that. But, you know, there are lots of ways they could do that. And it doesn't follow from that that deontic value is the way they would want to go. You know, you can have an ethic of duty that, you know, you want to look at, well, what are reasons for acting grounded on and what grounds duties, and that, you know, considering those kinds of things will give us a way of ranking them. Whereas going to deontic value, I think most people, you know, well, there's certainly ethics of duty for which that seems a really odd way of going. So if you're thinking about the ground of your obligation to create a trust in order to be able to care for your child, it's just to think that working out the stringency of that duty, that it's in any way relevant to the stringency of that duty, that perhaps there is some other child whose life would be more benefited by your creating a trust. You know, so, you know, in purely consequentialist terms, there could be some other bit of states of affairs you could bring about. That it just has no bearing at all on working out the stringency of your duty to create the child, which is grounded in the fact that a vulnerable human being was brought into existence without it say so by you. So the argument just depends on thinking that, I mean, the main move you had depended on thinking that, well, we just have to have a way of ranking duties, and so we would need a reason to think that there isn't any other way of doing that. And it still looks to me like that there's something, that the deontic value way of doing that is trying to incorporate consequentialist values in what it is to fulfill a duty, and an ethic of duty could resist that.
Yeah, okay, let me just address the first part of your question, because I think I understand that. I'm not sure I understand the other one. I think, yes, I'm sure some deontologists will have the same kind of reaction that you do, that somehow I'm trying to bring in consequentialist apparatus, as it were, into this deontological kind of world. I think it's too easy to be persuaded of that by seeing a number and thinking, oh my God, a number, this must be consequentialism here. The numbers are really very superficial here. The numbers here are a way of expressing the underlying fact, which is that some duties are more stringent than other duties, or that the grounds, as you said, of some duties create more stringent duties than other duties. The numbers just are a way of expressing that fact and capturing it and trying to express certain properties of that relationship. So I don't see it as necessarily bringing consequentialism. It doesn't necessarily have to import maximizing ideas, for example. You could have these numbers without thinking that it's your duty to maximize them, although that tends to be the model that I've used here. You could have a satisficing notion instead or something like that. In general, my view about these things is that deontologists have gotten away for a long time with fairly fuzzy thinking about really important issues for their moral theory because they've been unwilling to try to be more precise about how to express certain things, like how you compare the weights of these duties and so on, so that it's actually salutary for deontologism to bring in an effort to try to make it more precise, to express what's going on, so that you can see if there are any troubles that are created that way. So, okay.
I was wondering if there's a way of defending the symmetry claim by arguing that when you fulfill a promise, there's a positive value to that, but there was also a negative value to the duty having been created or the duty existing in the first place, versus there not being a negative value to no duty existing or no duty having been created in the first place. So the total outcome would still be 0, right, in the sense that, whoops, there's -10, and then it's canceled out by the fulfilling of the duty, whereas if there was no duty in the first place, then it's 0. So how to decide between the two views, right, whether it's one way or the other. I was thinking, think about two worlds that are created for just an instant, right? In one of them, an agent is born in a world with many duties, right? And then in the other world, he's created in that world with no duties whatsoever, and then the worlds disappear the next instant. So he has no opportunity to fulfill or violate the duties. Intuitively, I think it's quite plausible, I don't know anything about these topics, but to think that the second world is better in the sense that, well, the first world is harsh, right? It's really demanding to be in that kind of world.
Interesting. So I gather your idea is that to have a duty or to be under a duty is burdensome in itself. It's negative. It has negative value, and luckily for me, as it were, the negative value of having that duty exactly corresponds to the positive value that you'd get by fulfilling that duty. So it adds up to 0, and the results turn out to be the same in all of my kinds of cases.
Yeah, so there's still some asymmetry, but the asymmetry is not between fulfilling a duty and not violating a duty.
Yeah.
But it's between those two state of affairs.
Between
there being a duty. And
there being a duty and fulfilling
Yes.
it versus, yeah.
That's right.
Okay, that's worth thinking about. I guess I don't feel much attraction to the idea that having a duty is in itself burdensome or negative. It depends what the duty is. If the duty requires me to do something that's contrary to my inclinations, and I have to struggle with myself, not to be tempted not to do this duty and so on, then it would be burdensome. But some duties might be duties to do things that I'm much inclined to do anyway. They're no burden to me at all. So I'm not so attracted by the idea that merely the existence of a duty is in itself a negative value, but it's worth thinking about at any rate. Yeah.
Right.
Right, so, yeah. Thanks. So, I must admit, I find the whole idea of deonic value really, really mysterious. And I especially find it mysterious when you include, impersonal values, which I guess you have to do. And we have colleagues, or we have a colleague who thinks that value theory doesn't conform to axioms of transitivity and so forth. And what I conclude from that is that we would be better off doing without it if only we could. Maybe we can't do without deonic value. So if we're stuck, I'm not sure about that actually, but if we're stuck with it, well then I just wonder to what extent the problems that you turn up are problems that arise mainly from our assigning the wrong numbers to values. And if we only assign the right values, a lot of these paradoxes would dissolve. And so I think numbers are not innocuous here at all, but they're really maybe at the heart of the problem. And so, I guess we have a reason to conform to any promise we make. So there is going to be always a reason to conform. And suppose it's true, I'm not really sure it is, but suppose it's, hard cases aside, I mean, there might be promises that have a, I promise to kill somebody or something, but apart from those kinds of cases, I guess there's always a reason to conform to any promise. And so I gather that conformity to reason itself creates value. I guess that's true. It might be true sometimes, it might be true always, I'm not sure, but suppose it's true all the time. And then the question arises, well, how much value is there in creating reasons so that I can create value by conforming to the reasons I create? And maybe the answer to that is sometimes, maybe it's always, suppose it's always. But I mean, it seems to me that the answer is just going to be minuscule. And we're just not, that is the amount of value is going to be so vanishingly small. And we're often, I think, very unable to judge when a reason is vanishingly small and no reason at all. And so I just find that if you keep that in mind, then a lot of these paradoxes are going to become much less worrisome. So, maybe we've got a reason to eat our cars, right? And that's what some people have said for the minimal minerals they contain. And then I guess we've got a reason to get a car so we can eat it. But the strength of that reason is so unbelievably small, and in any given case, when you think about getting a car, there's going to be thousands of reasons. There's reasons everywhere. There's going to be reasons to get a car, reasons not to get a car, and the reason to get a car that is because I will be able to eat it and then get a mineral that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get is so vanishingly small that for all practical purposes you can afford to disregard it. And so the reason we might have to make promises so we can conform to them, which is going to add deonic value, is going to be so incredibly small that the paradoxes that come are just going to vanish because for all practical purposes the strength of these reasons is going to be close to zero.
Okay, so our colleague Larry Temkin, I assume is the person you have in mind, his work doesn't focus on deontic value, it focuses on, I've forgotten what the appropriate word here is, but the value of things that we rank as good or better and so on. I think, one question you could raise is whether the kinds of paradoxes that Larry has found in our rankings of some worlds as good or better than others and so on, showing that we don't have transitive judgments about those situations, whether those could be imported into judgments about what people ought to do. So suppose God is in a position of being able to create some of these worlds that Larry talks about, and the question is, should he create this world or should he create that world, and so on, then it might turn out that that the deontic values of his various acts of doing this would be intransitive. That wouldn't surprise me if something like that turned out to be true, and that would show that would show various problematic things, but it would show those problematic things kind of regardless of whether you were going to take the asymmetrical or the symmetrical view about these things. The second part of your comment is that if there is any positive deontic value to fulfilling obligations, it's so minuscule that there are not going to be any cases in which it makes a difference to what you ought to do, whether you should create that obligation or not, because the value of doing so will be so minuscule compared to the other values that will then be in play that you would never have an obligation to create that obligation. Well, I think it's one of the real problems for the deontologist in thinking about these deonic values is that it's very hard to know how large a value to ascribe to keeping a promise, for example. I mean, if you think that all cases of keeping legitimate promises have positive value, but you also recognize that it's more important to keep some promises than to keep other promises, then it looks like you're going to be in a position of having to say something like, the value of keeping a promise per se is the residual value that's there even in the most minor kind of promise that we think you don't have a very strong promise to keep. And any more serious promise that you have a much stronger reason to keep, it's not going to be because it's a keeping of a promise that you ought to do it, but because it would produce good effects or something like that. And that, I think you're right, that would reduce the actual value to keeping the promise or to violating the promise if you want to focus just on the negative side. Just qua keeping or violating a promise would be really teeny. There would still be, I mean, I could still describe paradoxical cases on the same model as the ones I've had here, except that the difference wouldn't be between, plus 100 and minus 100 or something, but it would be between plus 0.001 and minus 0.001. The paradoxes would still be there, but yeah, you're right. At that point, maybe we wouldn't care so much about them. But I think you're smelling out a problem for the deontologist here in exactly how large these values would be. But it's not just how large the positive values would be, it's also how large the negative values would be. So it's a problem even for someone who adopts the asymmetrical value approach.
36. Yeah, Holly, I really liked this, and I just want to, but there was something that flew by a little quickly because there was no diagram, and this was Charlene, and there was some implication that her fulfilling the duties she had to her friend and to tell the truth gave some sort of positive valence that isn't there in the normal case where we don't stab or claw someone. And then you gave another example where somebody spends a week keeping a lot of promises and someone else spends the same week doing things that are neutral. And I was trying to piece that together with the general picture, which, leaving aside problems of sort of what to think about deontic value, it surely seemed plausible to me that doing one's duty doesn't, that's a neutral thing. It's not doing one's duty. It's not, but doing one's duty is. So I didn't quite understand the Charlene thing. So I mean, the picture I sort of got was that if I'm out driving and I've got all sorts of duties to those pedestrians who might be crossing, but so there's a welter of duties, to A, to B, all the people that I could be running over. Suggested to me that somehow maybe if I'm in a hurry and I have, there's a temptation, I have a slight temptation to run over the pedestrians, that I get more credit for not doing so than if I just, the road is clear. I'm not in a hurry. They're not bothering me. They're not slowing me down. So I wasn't quite sure what the Charlene case was supposed to show that makes it somehow worth bringing in when you have these other examples.
Yeah, okay, so yes, I could have been more clear about sort of what that was supposed to show. So the Charlene case is the one where the professor asks her whether her friend Ed cheated, and she can either say no, which is true, or yes, which is false, or she can decline to answer somehow, which will raise the professor's suspicion. So what she ought to do to fulfill her various duties, she ought to say no. And I was contrasting her case implicitly with the case of somebody like Charlene herself, who's not in a position to fulfill or violate any duties for some reason. She's not, within reaching distance of anyone or whatever. And I was saying we tempted to think there's something better about Charlene and what she does when she says no than we think there is about Charlene in a case where she has no option to do anything of moral significance. There's just all these morally neutral duties that she could do. And trying to put my finger on what that was. And in doing that, I kind of slid over into talking about praiseworthiness or not, which Sam caught as sort of changing the subject in a way. But I think that may be right, that we, to put our finger on what's different about Charlene in the one case and in the morally neutral case, we have to talk about whether she's praiseworthy or not. Now, to move to your case of, you're driving down the highway and there are all these pedestrians you could, deliberately steer into and hit, but of course, in the normal case, you don't even think about that. You just keep driving and your only thought is how to avoid hitting the pedestrians. But there would be cases in which you have road rage or something like that, and you're tempted to run into them, and you master that temptation and you keep driving straight instead of steering into the pedestrians. And then we can ask, well, so are you praiseworthy? Do you get credit for mastering your temptation? My view about that is, and this is going back to some work I did a long time ago, we have two different models of situations in which people are thought to be morally worthy. So on one view, we have the idea of the kind of Mother Teresa pure person who's never tempted to do anything wrong. All she wants to do is the great stuff. Well, that's one way to be good. Another way to be good is to have lots of temptations to do bad things and to overcome those temptations. That's another way to be good, and you have to think about them differently. So when you're talking about the person who's tempted to run into the pedestrians and overcomes that temptation, you want to say, well, that guy's no Mother Teresa. He should never have been tempted to run into the pedestrians. But given that he was tempted to run into the pedestrians and he overcame that temptation to do what he knew to be his duty, there's another way in which we can admire him. So it's two different senses. Maybe that's helpful.
So I think we have time for one more. Let's go 34.
First, I think this is just repeating something that Professor Four said, but I mean, there are cases. I mean, there can be reasons for or against making a promise. To go back to the initial promise case, there can be reasons not to make a promise. It's just if it's completely trivial, or if it's there can be reasons not. There can be reasons where one ought to be making a promise. That. Fred needs the assurance he's in peril or something. He'll only get the good if I make the promise. I'm obligated to make the promise in that case, and so, also the value or the disvalue of keeping the promise will vary depending on the consequences. It doesn't necessarily mean that we just have to have a fixed amount of the value for the keeping the promise. It might vary depending on what's at stake. But nonetheless, it's not going to be the non-consequentialist is somebody who isn't a maximizer about good consequences. It's not a view that consequences don't count, right? So, just a naive question about actualism and positivism. I'm not sure I understand. Suppose that I ought to make the promise, to Fred who's in peril, and keep the promise. In fact, I won't. So given that I won't, I shouldn't make the promise. But isn't there something the positivist wants to say that's correct? That right now, what I ought to do is what's possible, namely, make the promise and keep it, since it will still be possible to keep it if I make it. So it's wrong for me not to make the promise to Fred. It's not as wrong as if I make the promise and don't keep it, but it's still wrong for me, I think, not to make the promise to Fred in this situation. He's in peril, et cetera, et cetera. And so my naive view is it seems like we need both. What does the actualist say about that case?
Okay, well, this is a huge debate, which we don't really have time to get into here, but the actualist would say if, in most cases where it's true that, suppose the situation is this. I could make the promise to Fred, who's in peril, and I could carry it out, but in fact, carrying it out would be so burdensome for me that in the last moment I'd have weakness of will or something like that, and I wouldn't carry it out. And if I didn't make the promise to him, my friend Joe would make the promise to him, and Joe would in fact carry out his promise. He would do it less well than I would, but nonetheless, Fred would get rescued in that case, whereas if I make the promise, then Fred's not going to get rescued. The actualist would say, no, actually, I should not make the promise, because if I make it, then Joe's going to go away, and Fred isn't going to get rescued, and Fred will die. Whereas if I don't make the promise, then Joe or whoever is going to make the promise, and he will rescue Fred, not quite as well as I would. Fred will lose a toe to frostbite or something, but still he'll be rescued. So the actualist will think about it that way, and the possibilist would say, forget all that. If I could make the promise and I could then carry it out, and that's the best course of action here, I should make the promise and then I should carry it out. And they would disregard how things are actually going to go. Now, huge debate about that, but.
Without disregarding, I can say it's still wrong. The best, what I ought to do is make the promise and keep it. It's less bad. It's less bad to make the promise and not keep it than to step back and let Joe stick it. Joe won't do it as well as me, so what's possible still determines what I have to do.
Well, in an earlier work of mine, I went over this and have two different papers on it, in which I changed my mind slightly. So in the first paper, I take the view that I just described for you as the actualist view. In the second paper, I said, for complicated reasons I won't go into, we have to shift the focus and not ask, what should I do here and now in isolation, but we should ask about each of the sequences of action, which is such that if I wanted now to do that sequence of actions, I would do it. Which of those sequences of actions would be best? And then do that sequence of action and start by doing the first action on that sequence of action. And then the question is it true that if I wanted to make the promise to Fred and carry it out, I would actually do that sequence of actions? Well, no, given what I just described, it's not true. Even if I wanted to do that, in the end, I'm going to have weakness of will. So on that view, it would still turn out that I shouldn't make the promise to Fred and go on like that, because that's not something that's available to me, actually, in view of my later weakness of will.